let's talk for a moment about Eldorado Games. Their first title, The Island of Eldorado, which I must say I've never actually seen in the wild, dropped in 2016, and so far has earned itself a pretty resounding meh by the community on BGG. Their second title,
Windward,
which released around 2020 and apparently was originally themed around whaling until someone said, yeah, that'd be a pretty bad idea, mate. And so they rethemed it around fantasy whaling, and perhaps as a result, it too is scoring around a meh. Also on BGG. Now their third title, Capone, which is the first of their games which I own, arrived on doorsteps in the beginning of 2021. And it had beautiful components and an interesting theme, but again, just mechanisms that felt flat and uninteresting, which is probably why it's trending in between the first two games. So I think it's safe to say that Eldorado's reputation precedes itself, especially as copies of its newest release, The Age of Atlantis, is beginning to arrive on doorsteps, at least here in the USA. And if I may allow just a brief peek behind the curtain of operations here at the Dice Tower, when I reached out to Tom Vassell and said that I'd like to review this game, and so far I think it's pretty good, he said, "You'll have to convince me the game is good, as I think this company makes bad games in general." Well, Tom, let me see what I can do. Hey there everyone, I'm Jeff, your tabletop technician here at the Dice Tower, and sure, I'll weather the storm of a detailed look at the Age of Atlantis, in which 1 to 4 players represent one of 4 houses of inhabitants on the island of Atlantis. Now, for years, Atlantis has been kept safe from the ocean by Poseidon, who has protected its vast and rare resources from the crushing waves of the Atlantic. However, as new invaders seek to plunder Atlantis of its many riches, you will be tasked with protecting the city at the heart of the island in exchange for staying in Poseidon's good graces. Now that sounds pretty compelling, which does make it kind of a bummer that I made all that up as a premise for playing this game, which Eldorado simply describes as a highly competitive engine-building civilization-like game. Now, as I mentioned, this game arrived on my doorstep just a few weeks ago, and I'll be honest, I don't quite remember why I backed it. See, while I didn't quite care for Capone, I backed this game before Capone delivered, and if I'm honest, I may not have known that both games were produced by the same publisher. Now, what I do know is that I've always had a bit of a closeted interest in Greek mythology, so the giant, imposing Poseidon statue at the center of this board may have been all it took to eke a full pledge out of me. But enough speculating. The island of Atlantis takes place on this circular island represented on the main board, and it's broken up into 8 territories denoting the 4 cardinal and 4 ordinal directions. In the center will sit Poseidon, which comes in either gray plastic or metal, depending on how financially responsible you were back in 2020. These 8 territories Voltron together to form districts, each of which provides its own resource: fish, wood, and orichalcum. A metal which has only ever been mentioned in ancient texts, and one which I must wonder was perhaps the inspiration behind vibranium. Now, these territories are further divided into the city, of which there is only 1 space in each territory, and the outskirts, of which there are 9. Around the board, you've got tracks for political power. Those are victory points. And Poseidon's favor. This can be treated as a resource, but is also a stepping point towards higher in-game scoring. You've also got achievement counters for 3 ages, stacks of cards for 3 ages, an age marker, and a phase round tracker thingy. Okay, that finally covers the main board. Next up is, the player boards. Each player board is 2-layered and is organized into rows for each age of the game and columns for each building a player can build. These spots denote actions you can take at each building, and these indented spaces are for marking the technologies you've developed during the game. Lastly, you've got a space for tracking your resources, and a space to park a few spare workers. Yes, the Age of Atlantis has tech trees, and yes, it's a worker placement game, but we're not done yet. You also have myth boards, which are where you store these massive, imposing, and potentially pre-painted 2020 potential surplus tender pending myths, as well as your available workers to start the game and a few trackers for the upgradable abilities of your specific myth. But how do you play the game? Actually, that's pretty simple. On your turn, you'll simply place one of your active workers from your myth board onto the main board. There are just 6 actions you can then take, such as gathering resources from the district you've placed the worker in, building a building by paying the costs shown on your player board, performing an action relevant to a building already at that space, researching a technology relevant to a building already at that space, attacking an enemy at that space, performing an action at that space, or hopping into one of your myths at that space. At which point you can trigger one of the 4 myth actions, one of which is specific to your myth. Now, once you've placed all of your workers, you'll bring them back to your myth board, let them rest, make sure you didn't tick off Poseidon, advance any enemies closer to the city, make sure Poseidon isn't really angry, spin him around to face a new territory, roll a dice and put out some more cards. Oh, and see if enough achievements have been met to advance to the next age. Once the 3rd age is finished, the game is over. That's it! Easy peasy. At least that's what you'd think after you had just read this, a 19 by 12.5 two-sided piece of paper folded in half to represent the Age of Atlantis' rules. At least that's what I thought when I sat down to my first game with my wife, to whom I just explained the board and the components and the rules to in the same way as I just did to you. And then I put my first worker on the board and thought, okay, what do I do now? I guess I'll build a building. I mean, what do the buildings do anyways? Oh my god. And that is when you'll realize that this is where the majority of the game lives. At the beginning of the game, Atlantis is practically a wasteland, devoid of life and purpose. But as players develop the island, suddenly it becomes rich in activity, potential, and eventually, conflict. But for now, perhaps you'll build a modest town center, which can generate happiness for your workers. And that's important, since a happy worker will do more work. You see, when you place a worker, you get a free action to take, but you can get more actions when you rotate that worker from happy to content to, American, I guess, until he is miserable and without much purpose left to live. But the town center can also reward you with victory political power for each smiley face left on your workers at the end of each year. And in later ages, you can visit a town center to gain a new worker while further researching the building to provide medical aid, which will actually cheer up your workers at the end of each year. And this is important because each unhappy worker will lose you favor with Poseidon and of course won't score any points. This means you could focus your effort on a utopian type society where you flush your civilization with elated happy workers who could give you a buttload of points and potentially even resources at the end of each year. I'll actually pause here for a moment to explain the research of this game a little better. See, each building provides a variety of technological advancements, such as the grain silo of your mill, which unlocks extra storage for resources on your player board. Once you've researched the grain silo, you have it, and that's about it. But there's also incremental advancements available with each building, and I think the best one to demonstrate this with is the outpost. The outpost is a military structure that, in its base form, provides an action that does 4 damage to any adjacent enemy. That's pretty nice, but with 24 potential spaces in which enemies can spawn, and spawns being dictated by a roll of these 8-sided dice, getting a chance to lay waste to 4 armies with a single shot is pretty close to zilch. But with a single upgrade to your outpost, which by the way, a single research carries the same cost as building the building itself, since I didn't mention it, will then allow the outpost to hit any enemy in your territory. This is a new technology called Watchtower, so I place a new cube. But you'll see that there's a line from that tech to Guard Tower, which lets you target enemies in your larger district. This is an upgrade to Watchtower, so I move the cube down to the new tech. Now, I skipped over most of the mill building, which simply lets you increase the rate at which you gather resources because I wanted to get to this, the temple. This building lets you deploy the powerful yet quite expensive myths I've mentioned so far. I pointed out earlier that all the myths are unique. While they will each allow you to move, gather resources, and attack enemies, the rate at which each can do so differs from one to the other. You can also upgrade these actions at, you guessed it, the temple. They can also be upgraded to attack adjacent spaces simultaneously, grant points for each action, or allow you to deploy your myth anywhere on the board, instead of the default territory-only option. Now in addition, each myth has its own unique ability, though they cannot be further upgraded. The Minotaur can rage, dealing 2 points of damage to every invading army in its territory. The Pegasus can not only deploy a new worker, but can place that worker where there's already another one standing. Not only that, it triggers that worker to activate before the end of your turn. The Centaur improves the morale of all your workers in its territory, and the three-headed Cerberus, somewhat oddly, just gathers a shedload of resources. Now, all of that is pretty neat, pretty immersive, and already gives this game a broad range of branching options, but we're just getting started. Each faction in the game has a unique building which only it can build and only it can use. Because again, I left out the fact that you can place your worker at and activate any building belonging to any player without any cost to yourself except for these unique buildings. And not only do these buildings grant unique abilities to their player, but they change the experience for everyone at the table. The Creon faction can build a monument, which lets them redirect Poseidon's attention, or blessing, to any territory on the board. And this is useful since each worker placed in a territory blessed by Poseidon gets one extra free action to take on its turn. And not only that, but they can research tech to give them points when they choose a blessed spot, or give them points when an opponent chooses a blessed spot, or even spend Poseidon's favor to reclaim the worker at their own monument, allowing them to repeat all of these actions at least twice in a single year. The Nissos faction, which by the way is the faction always played by your solo AI opponent, Plato, places the Capitol building. This building lets them build tax centers on any space on the board, which grants them points every time an opponent takes an action at that space. Tax the blue player's monument? Pretty wise idea. They can of course upgrade the points earned by each taken action, but that's not all. These jerks can upgrade to an ability that lets them force resources or morale on other players and give themselves points and favor for each resource or morale given. I mean, donating to the lesser fortunate in exchange for personal rampant gain? Who would even think of something like that? Oh, jeez! The Biston faction builds a factory, which in a unique twist lets them build up to 3 copies of each of the base 4 buildings in the game. They can also gain points whenever another player visits their buildings, but they can also demo any building on the map, forcing other players to constantly rebuild their own buildings or just give in to Biston's monopoly. Yay for capitalism! Lastly, in a move after my own heart, the Altez faction can build a tavern, which they can visit to obtain a contract. Each contract gives a relatively easy goal to achieve just 2 times. At which point they can return to the tavern to turn in the contract for a value of points, which of course can be increased throughout the game. And besides just all the different ideas of these factions, each also has a different bonus which is scored at the end of the game. Creon scores a point for each active worker, Nissos scores a point for each tax center on the board, Biston scores a point for each of its buildings on the map, and Altez scores a point for each completed contract. Is that enough variety for you? Because I gotta tell you, the breadth of things that players have to consider, especially in the later stages of the game, not just of their own goals and needs, but of points that could be funneling to other players, or just wide swings in the game state from one turn to the next, make this one of the most surprising and unexpected games I've ever played. And it's not just that a player can rotate Poseidon, maybe robbing you of an action that you were gonna take there, or visiting a building of your own, forcing you to go somewhere else. It's the fact that they can create these choke points or even droughts of actions that could last the entire game. I mean, maybe a player just decides not to build one of their core buildings, forcing them and everyone else to share the ones already in play. Maybe a player decides to hoard the blessings of Poseidon, forcing everyone else at the table to drive their own workers into the ground year after year. And all of this forces everyone, even the players who it may seem have the game firmly under their grasps, to scramble and constantly think ahead, just trying to wring every bit of forward movement out of their actions. And all of this easily distracts you from some of the other elements of the game I've already glossed over, like the enemy cards that spawn each year. These armies will march towards the city after all players have taken their actions. And if they ever land on a building or cross the city walls, Poseidon rage floods the entire territory, washing away all cards, players' buildings, tax centers, and even their myths. All players will lose favor with Poseidon if this happens, even players who weren't affected by the flood. And if a player should ever land in this penalty box space before the Poseidon's Fury phase, they incur, you guessed it, the Fury of Poseidon, which forbids a player from entering a blessed territory for at least the next year if they manage to stay out of further trouble. Now, this might incentivize players to work together to defend their city. But if a player has ample favor and is maybe a little miffed at you for whatever reason, they might just be content to watch your stuff float away. And again, this adds more complexity, more decision space, more stuff for players to consider in a game that comes with just 4 pages of rules. In the end, the players will make this game far more complex than its rules will. But not everything here is peaches and cream. I did start off mentioning the scant rulebook, which honestly isn't the worst rulebook I've ever read. It does explain the board, the process of a turn, the basic actions, and the general do's and don'ts of the game. But it doesn't answer all the questions though, like for example, is a flooded territory permanently flooded, or can it be used later in the game? Which you can infer by reading this variance booklet, which provides rules for a permanent flooding variant. These player boards, especially the resource track at the bottom, is no joy either. When you're trying to move these tiny little resource markers across them, stacking them up, tweezering them out from between each other, these are just kinda dumb. And speaking of tiny things, these little cards are almost impossible to shuffle. And while I realize that they need to fit on the spaces of the board, and even then they overlap on the innermost spaces, they're just a bit difficult to manage. But the biggest sin in this box is this, the 2-sided player board reference guide, which provides detailed information about every action on the player boards, every technology, the actions on the main board, and some of the unique enemy and action cards that come in these decks. Players will need to read nearly every size 8 font word on this page before they'll have any idea what each of their buildings can do, and only then will they know that some of these actions can only be taken twice per year, since there's no mention of this on any of the player boards. So, how many of these magazine-grade rule sheets come in this oversized box? 1 super thin, fragile piece of paper to be fought over around the table like illegal contraband. And to add insult to injury, this thing is 9.5 by 11 inches, which means you can't even toss it onto a photocopier to run off a few extra sheets. Shame on you, El Dorado, for making a metal statue, pre-painted minis, screen-printed buildings, and tossing 1 flimsy sheet of critical rules into a $135 box. And taking all of this into consideration, I have to give this game a 9. Who's that, Tom? He's coming for me. I know it. Man, I just really like this game. My favorite games in my collection are the ones that reward efficient play, where making the right moves in the right order can pay huge dividends as the game goes on. That's one reason why I'm one of the few folks who likes the game Tapestry, even though I'm really bad at the game Tapestry. I also love games that start you off with very little and make you feel like a king by the game's end. And I really enjoy games that let you experiment with their systems, because in the Age of Atlantis, there's no way that you can do everything that this game would let you do in a single setting. In fact, that's one of the few complaints out on BGG, is that the pacing of this game actually feels a little too fast. And yeah, maybe I should explain that just a little bit more. I mentioned that you work towards these achievements in order to advance from one age to the next, and that at the end of each round, you check to see if all players have completed a total number of achievements in that age based on the number of players. In my first 2-player game of this with my wife, I intentionally held back on an achievement that would have ended the second age in a single year, instead stretching it out to 2, and yet we still ended the third age in a single year. Now in my more recent 3-player game of this, we sat in the second age for 4 years, and yet still ended the third age in just 1. And I can certainly get that it's kind of a bummer, but it's also kind of funny, right? I mean, after 2 hours of this game, we want just a little more of it. Of course, the timing also adds a bit more strategy, because in that last game, I swore that we would have 1 more year that I could use to run up the favor track, scoring double my endgame points. And then I watched in abject horror as the blue player used the last 2 workers that round to score 2 uncontested achievements, ending the game with a flurry of points and the win. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I will say that that player later confessed that he didn't really enjoy his experience of playing the game because he felt like he was just being pulled in too many different directions. This is definitely not a game for folks who struggle with analysis paralysis or for folks who just get overwhelmed at having too many available decisions. I, however, am just enthralled by this game, and I've even sat and thought about just what it would be like if a player managed to max out one of their buildings and then just went to town on everybody else around the table. I also really enjoy playing this game solo because it's a great way to experiment with the different factions, well, all except for the green one, and get to test out the different synergies between their advancements. I think, based on my small experience and the feedback from other folks, that this is hands down the best El Dorado game to date. And that's considering the fact that all backers were basically forced to fork out an extra $5 to get these games to ship earlier this year. I realize that we're all in different situations financially, but I didn't really have a problem spending $5 so that El Dorado wouldn't have to lose 30,000 or whatever. But regardless, that's one reason why this game isn't scoring as well on BGG, as a few bent out of shape players are holding its rating ransom for $5 measly. Now, for what it's worth, I did reach out to designer Daniel Aronson, who did reveal that there aren't current plans for this game to come to retail, but does hope that it can happen soon, albeit with a plastic Poseidon and basic gray plastic myths. He did also reveal that a second printing with an expansion and some better player aids might happen at some point down the road. For now, honestly, I've played this game a bunch of times. I haven't even tried out the yellow faction yet, and I still have much to discover from the other factions. If this sounds interesting to you, I'm sure you can snag a copy off the secondary market without too much effort. And if it doesn't, well then, no favor for you. Cheers. What? Bonus content? On the Dice Tower? No way! Alright, here's the deal. I mentioned solo play a couple times in this review, and I thought I'd do the game a little extra justice and talk about the solo experience of the Age of Atlantis. Now, obviously, if you don't play solo games, you're more than welcome to go check out some of the additional fantastic content here on the Dice Tower channel. But for the folks still here with me, let's get to it. The variants rulebook I briefly mentioned in my full review also includes these 2 pages of rules for solo play. And there's also this very thin, very small, and very cheap player aid as well. And if we agree that the rules of this game aren't that great to begin with, well then these are crap. I also mentioned that the solo bot Plato always plays as the Nissos faction. They're the ones who place the tax stations around the board in order to grab points whenever a player takes an action on a space with a tax station. They also have this small deck of cards which list a random building and territory on the map. When Plato would take a turn, you reveal the top card and let the flowchart begin. First, if the AI can, it builds that building in any legal space in that territory. Now this is where I must admit I did skip a couple rules in my full review. You see, in addition to the morale of your workers, they also come in 2 different flavors: peasant and Atlantean. Peasants can only work within the 8 city spaces, while Atlanteans have access to the full board. Of course, all players, including Plato, start the game off with only peasants. So on its first turn, it may not be able to place a building in the space it was going to target if you've managed to already park a worker there. And how might you be so fortunate to pull that off, I wonder? Now, if Plato can't build the building either because he's already built it or because there's no available space, then he'll try to visit any instance of that building anywhere on the map. Now, the less than stellar rulebook does say that Plato will play all of its peasants before it will play any Atlanteans. So if that building is present in the outskirts, but Plato still has a peasant left, then he won't visit that building. At least that's how I'm reading it. If Plato does manage to visit the building, then there's a quick list in the rulebook and also here in the tissue square of a strategy guide telling you what he'll do at each building, and honestly, they're pretty straightforward. At the mill, he simply grabs a few points. At the town center, he gets a new worker. At the outpost, he zaps 2 enemies anywhere in the district. And if he visits his own capital, well, I'm not really sure what he does, because you see, the text on this rulebook and the text on this strategy stamp quite wildly contradict each other. The book says Plato places a tax station on a space of your choosing. The strategy stamp says to place the tax station on building. What building, who's building, what you building, who the heck knows? If Plato can't visit the building for any of the growing list of reasons, well then things suddenly get a little weird. You see, his focus will return to the territory listed on the card, but then you and you alone get to decide where he goes. You can place him into any building which gives him the least reward. You can place him into one of his myths if available. You do not want to do that. Or more commonly, you'll probably let him attack an enemy in that territory. Now this also comes at a potential risk because you see, Plato starts off the game with 5 technologies already researched, and he'll score and use those technologies as long as your game is within the current age where those technologies apply. So for example, Plato scores points for every point of damage dealt to an enemy, and scores points for defeating enemies without a myth. That was helpful. I'm glad this isn't like a super fragile piece of paper that I dropped, because that could have really done some damage. Now these rules also seem to imply that Plato's workers deal infinite damage, so you'll have to choose wisely with the choice that you'll be choosing to choose. Now, if for any reason Plato can't do anything in that region, he'll simply go and visit the Poseidon statue, taking both actions at that location. First, this is how all players upgrade peasants to Atlanteans, and he'll also nab a few extra favor with Poseidon. By the way, the only way that Plato loses favor with Poseidon is if a territory floods, which you may find yourself letting happen on purpose just to lower his endgame scoring potential. Now, let's talk about the gameplay. For you, the player, the Age of Atlantis plays the same, and while the AI acts somewhat sporadically given the random nature of a deck of cards, it's actually a bit more predictable than you might think, because plot twist! The actions on the Plato cards are printed on both sides. Now, like me, you might tend to think, well, doesn't this just make it kind of easy? Well, yes and no. See, by knowing Plato's next move, you can of course block it. But then you have to make that decision as to whether it's better to block Plato's progress or try to make some of your own. What I found most interesting was that when I knew what Plato was going to do in this move, I just found myself worried about what it was going to do after this move. Because by knowing how many points Plato will make on this turn, you're more concerned about how many points Plato is going to make on its next turn. In my first few solo games of the Age of Atlantis, I was blowing Plato out of the water. A few days later, my friend and yours, Mike Delisio, pointed out the word any in the rulebook in regards to Plato's preference to visit a building anywhere on the map instead of just within the targeted territory as I had previously thought. This drastically changed up gameplay, and in my next solo game, not only were the scores much tighter, but I also scored much lower as I struggled with that to block or not to block mentality. Suffice to say that deep strategic and tactical depth is alive and well in the solo experience of the Age of Atlantis. Of course, us board gamers tend to be a bit more critical of aspects of games in solo play than we are in competitive play, so let me cover the Age of Atlantis from a slightly higher elevation. First off, solo games work best if there isn't much difference in the setup, especially if you don't have to remove any specific items like cards from decks, for example. The Age of Atlantis handles this quite well, with nothing but Plato's deck needing a quick shuffle before you get started. Now, you are setting up for 2 different players, and the only thing you don't manage for Plato is the resources, at least that's what I think, since the rulebook doesn't specifically mention so. Second of all, I like a solo game where the AI turns are fast, much faster than my own, and that's because I just tend to get distracted sometimes, and then I forget whose turn I was in the middle of managing. For the most part, in the Age of Atlantis, you can flip a card, drop a cube, dole out a few points, and then get on with your life. The only thing that might bog things down every once in a while is the whole player's choice thing, and honestly, it just seems a little bit weird, as the one thing that the rulebook clearly states is that a player may choose the option that is most beneficial to themselves. It just feels a bit dirty, doesn't it? The most important aspect of a solo game for me, though, is whether or not I can get the full experience of the game. And what I mean by that is, I don't like solo games where certain moves, or certain scoring conditions, or even certain strategies are off limits because maybe they can't be worked around a scripted bot, or maybe they require a more specific form of interaction. The Age of Atlantis almost fits this bill perfectly, with the only major caveat being that you can never play as the Nissos faction. And the more I think of it, the more I really can't explain why. I mean, yes, to have 4 separate bots for the 4 factions would require 4 specific sets of rules. Okay, the game came out a year late. Could have used that time. But I digress. I mean, yes, it's a bummer, but let's face it. At some point, some BGG user will map out new rules for the other 3 factions and probably better rules for the Nissos faction. Until then, there is still plenty for me to see, feel, and experiment with in the vanilla game of the Age of Atlantis. And again, that little twist of knowing what the AI is going to do next just manages to crank up the brain noodle to 11, giving you plenty to ponder. If he manages to put that Capitol building down, I really want to stop him from doing that, but I really need to do this. How does Delisio maintain that smashing beard? Yeah, so anyways, given my stance on the game so far, it probably doesn't surprise you that I'm equally enamored with the solo experience of the Age of Atlantis. Average setup, low fiddle factor, most of the full experience, and gobs of replayability. I dig it, and I give it an 8, given those less than exemplary rules so far. Other than that, I'm really out this time. I'll catch you later. Cheers. Made you look.